Welcome to Scoli Sleep Stories. Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable, let the day soften around you, and settle in for a calm documentary made for curious minds. If these stories help you rest, learn, or simply enjoy a quieter part of the day, please consider liking this episode and subscribing to the channel. Now, when you are ready, let us begin. Chapter 1. A letter begins its journey. Beneath the steady light of a lamp, a sheet of paper rests upon a table. A hand has moved slowly across it, leaving lines of dark ink. Perhaps the letter contains news of ordinary days. It may describe a change in the weather, a visit from a neighbor, or the first flowers appearing beside a familiar path. Perhaps it offers thanks, asks a gentle question, or simply says that one person has been thinking of another. At last, the writer reaches the final line. There is a closing phrase, a familiar name, and then a pause. The pen is set down. For a little while the words remain close to the person who wrote them, held within the quiet circle of lamplight. Soon, however, they will begin to travel. The paper is folded and placed inside an envelope. On the front the writer adds an address. To human eyes, an address may seem like a modest gathering of names and numbers. Yet to a postal network, it is a set of careful instructions. It may identify a person or an institution, followed by a house or building, a street, a locality, and a postal code. Together, these details turn the simple idea of someone, somewhere, into a destination that the postal system can follow. The address gives each worker, vehicle, and sorting stage the information needed to guide the letter onward. In one corner of the envelope, the writer places a stamp. The stamp is a form of postage. It shows that the required charge for carrying the letter has been paid. Other postage markings can serve the same purpose, but the small stamp remains a familiar sign that the letter is ready to enter the postal system. The writer carries the envelope outside. Evening has softened the edges of the street. Windows glow in nearby houses, and the road is becoming still. At the corner stands a mailbox, waiting quietly beneath a tree. The little door opens. The letter slips inside. There is a faint sound as it lands among the other envelopes. Then the door closes, and the writer walks home. From the outside, nothing more seems to happen. The box remains silent and unmoving. Yet the letter has crossed an important boundary. It has passed from a private room into a public network. Its journey now depends upon people who may never know the writer, the recipient, or the meaning of the words sealed inside. At an appointed time, a postal worker unlocks the box. The waiting letters are gathered into a container and carried away. This is collection, the first stage in the familiar chain of postal work. The mail then moves toward processing. It may go to a local post office, or to a larger building where letters from many streets arrive together. There, each item is read by its outer markings. The message itself remains private. The address, placed where the network can see it, points the way. A postmark may be added to the envelope. This records postal handling and often shows where or when the item was processed. A cancellation is placed over the stamp so that the stamp cannot be used again. Sometimes the postmark and cancellation appear together, leaving a small visible trace of the letter's passage through the system. Then comes sorting. Letters traveling in similar directions are gathered together. One may be going to the next street. Another may be bound for a town beyond the hills. A third may be beginning a journey across an ocean. They entered the same mailbox and rested beside one another for a little while, but now their paths begin to separate. The route followed by a letter may not look like a straight line on a map. Postal systems rely upon central gathering places known as hubs. A postal hub receives mail from many surrounding locations, sorts it according to destination, and redirects it along established routes. Because of this, a letter may first travel in a direction that seems to lead away from its destination. It may join thousands of other items at a shared center before turning toward the place named on its envelope. The journey can appear indirect, yet the use of hubs allows large quantities of mail to move in an orderly and reliable way. It is a little like water entering a network of channels. Small streams join broader currents, travel together for a time, and then divide again as they approach different destinations. Once the mail has been sorted, it is prepared for dispatch. A dispatch is a group of postal items sent onward together. The letter may be placed in a sack, a tray, or another secure container, From there it may travel by road, railway, ship, or aircraft. During a long journey it may change carriers and vehicles many times. At each stage, the same calm pattern continues. The letter is accepted, identified, sorted, carried, and transferred. Eventually it reaches the region named in its address. It enters a local route, where a carrier takes responsibility for the final part of the journey. The carrier follows familiar streets and paths until the instructions written on the envelope become a real place. A line of ink becomes a town, another becomes a street, a number becomes a building, a doorway, or a waiting postbox. And at last, the letter is placed within reach of the person for whom it was written. Many hands have helped it along, although few have held it for more than a moment. This is one of the central truths of postal history. Reliable mail depends less upon one unusually swift messenger than upon cooperation among many ordinary workers. Each person completes one part of the larger task. When those parts fit together, a small piece of paper can cross a country or an ocean, while the handwriting upon it remains unchanged. The envelope, however, has not always been such a familiar companion to a letter. Before manufactured envelopes became common, writers often used a single sheet of paper for both the message and its covering. They wrote the letter, then folded the paper inward so that the words were hidden. The address was added to the clean outer surface. The folded sheet might be closed with sealing wax. Warm wax held the paper shut and could be pressed with a stamp or signet. At other times, the writer used a wafer seal, a small prepared disc that fastened the folded paper when moistened. Such a letter had no separate envelope. The same sheet carried the private message within and the public directions without. Its folds protected the writing, while its outer face told each messenger and postal worker where it should go. The question of payment was also different. In many earlier postal systems, the sender did not pay before the letter began its journey. Instead, the recipient paid the charge when the letter arrived. The words could travel a considerable distance before the cost of their passage was collected at the far end of the route. Much later, prepaid postage and stamps would make this exchange simpler, but for a long time, receiving a letter also meant receiving the charge attached to its journey. The materials and markings have changed, yet the essential task has remained remarkably steady. A postal system must accept a message. It must identify the destination. It must sort the message toward the proper route, carry it between stages, transfer it into local hands, and finally place it before the intended recipient. This pattern is older than the modern mailbox, older than the adhesive stamp, and older than the postal codes that now help guide letters through busy networks. There was no single moment when the post office appeared in its complete form. Postal history is not the story of one invention moving neatly from one civilization to another. In many places, societies developed their own ways of carrying messages. They used messengers, roads, relays, ships, and arrangements for local delivery. The methods differed from region to region. A message might be carried by one person for part of the way and entrusted to another at the next stage. It might travel over a road, cross water aboard a ship, and return to land in different hands. The route depended upon the landscape, the available means of travel, and the people responsible for keeping communication moving. Yet beneath these many arrangements, the enduring pattern can still be recognized. Accept the message, learn where it must go, place it with other messages traveling in the same direction, carry it onward, transfer it when the route changes, then guide it through the last local stage and into the recipient's hands. A modern letter still follows this ancient rhythm. Inside its envelope, the paper does not know whether it is resting in a sack, a tray, or a sorting room. It does not know when one carrier gives way to another, or when one vehicle reaches the end of its part of the route. It may pass beneath bright lamps in a processing building. It may wait quietly while other letters gather around it. It may travel through the night while the writer sleeps and the recipient goes about an ordinary evening, not yet knowing that familiar handwriting is drawing closer. The actual route may bend from one hub to another. The carriers may change. The vehicles may change. The letter may be lifted, sorted, gathered, carried, and transferred again. And throughout the journey it remains itself. It is still the same folded paper. The final line has not altered. The name beneath it remains where the writer placed it. The thoughts formed in the quiet room continue onward, protected by the envelope and guided by the address. Now the mailbox at the corner is empty again. Its collected letters have moved beyond the familiar street and entered the wider network. For a short time they travel together, then one by one their destinations draw them apart. One turns toward a nearby neighborhood, another begins a longer journey. Each follows the same patient sequence of collection, sorting, transportation, transfer, and delivery. But the wish to send words beyond the horizon is far older than the box, a stamp, or the numbered street. Long before postmarks and postal codes, rulers and communities were already considering the same quiet question. How might a message reach someone far away? How could words be entrusted to a traveler, carried beyond familiar ground, and delivered into waiting hands? To find the earliest organized answers, the road leads backward. It passes beyond the evening street and the lamplit room, toward broad riverbanks, dusty roads, sunlit courtyards, and long paths pressed into dry earth. There, in the ancient world, the first organized couriers were already setting out, carrying messages beyond the horizon. Chapter 2: Messengers of the Ancient World. Long before the familiar mailbox stood at the corner, a written message might begin beside a river. In ancient Egypt, a scribe sat with a sheet of papyrus before him. Papyrus was an important writing material, made from a tall river plant whose pale inner fibers could be pressed into a smooth surface. Beneath careful hands, dark ink formed instructions, accounts, reports, and lists. When the writing was finished, the document might be rolled, tied, and entrusted to a messenger who would carry it from one part of the kingdom to another. Egyptian rulers governed a long territory shaped by the Nile. Fields, temples, storehouses, quarries, and settlements lay along its banks. To manage these places, administrators needed information. They sent written orders outward and received reports in return. Messengers traveled by road and river, linking officials who could not meet face to face. The Universal Postal Union identifies an Egyptian document dated to 255 BCE as the earliest known surviving postal document. It is a quiet piece of evidence from a distant age. Yet it should not be mistaken for the first message ever carried, either in Egypt or anywhere else. Countless earlier messages may have disappeared because their writing materials decayed, were reused, or simply did not happen to survive. Archaeology often gives us not the first event, but the earliest trace that time has left within our reach. Nor did ancient Egypt possess a public post office in the modern sense. An ordinary resident could not simply hand over a personal letter and expect a regular service to deliver it to any address. The organized messengers generally served rulers, temples, military authorities, and administrators. Their work helped the state gather taxes, distribute resources, record harvests, and maintain contact across a long distance. Farther east, another system made especially clear use of roads, stations, and changing horses. The Achaemenid Persian Empire extended across a vast region, joining many lands, languages, and local traditions beneath imperial rule. Particularly under Darius I, royal communication became highly organized. Important roads linked administrative centers. Along those roads stood stations where authorized travelers and couriers could find supplies and fresh mounts. The best known of these routes was the Royal Road. It connected Sardis in western Anatolia with Susa, farther east, though other roads also continued through the empire. Estimates of the road's full length, the number of stations, and the time required to cross it vary. Ancient descriptions and modern reconstructions do not always agree. What matters most is the steady pattern. The route was divided into manageable stages, and each stage offered support for the next. Imagine a station courtyard resting in the shade of an awning. A horse drinks quietly from a trough. Leather tack hangs from a wooden peg. An attendant waits to examine an official credential, because the royal network was carefully controlled and its resources were not open to every traveler. A courier arrives with dust upon his clothing. The message is secure. Nearby, a rested horse is waiting. By changing mounts along the way, the journey could continue without requiring one animal to cover the entire distance. In some cases, one courier might hand a dispatch to another. In others, the same messenger could continue onward with a fresh horse. The important principle was continuity. Each station was one small point of order along a very long line. A message approached from one direction, paused briefly, and then moved on. Behind it lay the road already crossed. Ahead waited another station, another courtyard, and another measured stage. Greek writers admired the speed and discipline of the Persian royal couriers. Herodotus described them as continuing through snow, rain, heat, and darkness. A version of his wording later became closely associated with postal workers in the United States, particularly through an inscription on a post office building in New York. It is often called the motto of the United States Postal Service, but the service has no official motto. The famous words began instead as praise for the royal messengers of ancient Persia. Their journeys were impressive, though their purpose was practical rather than romantic. The Persian king and his officials needed to know what was happening across distant provinces. Orders had to travel outward. Reports, revenues, and observations had to return. The network principally served royal administration. It was not an unrestricted system through which anyone could send an ordinary letter. Across Asia, Chinese states also developed courier arrangements over many centuries. Traditions and records describe messengers and relays by the Shang and Zhou periods, while the development of these systems is more securely documented under the Qin and Han dynasties. As broad territories came under centralized government, communication routes helped officials carry instructions, records, and reports between the court and the provinces. Chinese systems distinguished among messages carried on foot, on horseback, or by vehicle. The method depended on the road, the nature of the dispatch, and the resources available. Stations could provide rest, official credentials, and a change of transport. As in Persia, credentials mattered. A station's animals, food, and lodging belonged to an administrative system. A courier might carry a written permit, a seal, or a token recognized at checkpoints and stopping places. A painted brick from the 3rd or 4th century CE depicts a mounted courier carrying such an official token. The image preserves a simple moment. A rider is on duty, passing between one station and the next, with proof that the resources of the route are available to him. These Chinese relays mainly served the needs of government. They were not general home delivery systems. Even so, parts of their routine would be recognizable to anyone who has watched a later postal network at work. A message was identified and authorized, it was placed in trusted hands, carried along a known route, and supported by a sequence of prepared stopping places. Around the Aegean Sea, the landscape encouraged a somewhat different pattern. The Greek world was divided among many city-states rather than governed through one continuous imperial administration. Messages moved along roads, over mountain paths, and aboard vessels traveling among islands and coastal settlements. Some city-states used professional runners, known as hemerodromoi, meaning day runners. Trained for long distances, they carried news or official requests across terrain where horses were not always convenient. Maritime messengers also crossed the water, carrying letters and spoken reports from one harbor to another. The Greek city-states did not create one unified general postal network comparable to the Persian royal system or to the later Roman imperial network. Their messengers belonged to particular cities, armies, households, or diplomatic missions. The best-known Greek messenger story concerns Pheidippides, but ancient accounts of his journeys differ. The familiar tale in which a runner travels from Marathon to Athens, announces victory, and then dies, developed through later retelling. Behind the legend lies a quieter historical truth. Trained runners were indeed used to carry important messages. Their practiced feet followed roads and paths long before fixed postal routes joined whole regions together. With Rome, roads, permits, stations, animals, and vehicles became part of an especially extensive state network. During the reign of Augustus, the first Roman emperor, a transport and communication system was established that later became known as the cursus publicus. The name can be understood as the public course, or the state transport system. Yet public did not mean that everyone could freely use it. Like many earlier networks, it served the government. Roman roads extended across much of Europe, North Africa, and the Near East. Their surfaces varied, though major routes could be carefully engineered with firm foundations, drainage, bridges, and milestones. Along these roads went officials, soldiers, government correspondence, tax records, legal instructions, and reports from provincial governors. The roads gave movement a visible order. Milestones marked the distance. Bridges carried travelers across streams and rivers. At crossings and junctions, one road joined another, opening a route toward a provincial town, an administrative center, or a distant frontier. Travel through the official system required authorization. A permit allowed a messenger or state traveler to obtain animals, vehicles, and assistance. Smaller change stations were called mutationes. At one of these, tired animals could be exchanged for rested ones. Larger stopping places, known as mansiones, offered more substantial services, including food and lodging. At evening, lamps might glow inside a mansio, while animals settled in a nearby stable. A traveler could eat, consider the road ahead, and protect official papers from weather and wear. Beyond the doorway, the road rested beneath the fading light. At another hour, sandals sounded upon stone, cartwheels turned, and a mounted courier departed beneath the measured line of milestones. Here again the journey unfolded in stages. One place offered a fresh animal, another provided a meal and a night's rest. A permit opened access to supplies. The road itself guided the traveler onward. Yet Roman communication did not always work as a simple relay, with a message passing from hand to hand. Sometimes one courier remained with a dispatch throughout the entire journey. Written instructions could be brief, and officials at the destination might wish to question the messenger about circumstances not fully explained in the document. The courier therefore carried both the letter and a memory of the place from which it had come. He might remember the manner in which the instructions had been given, the conditions along the road, or the spoken details that accompanied the written words. On arrival, the document could be opened and read. Then the messenger could answer questions, adding a human voice to the formal lines of ink. The cursus publicus supported official travelers, government correspondence, and state transport. Private Romans usually had no equal right to use it. Instead, they relied on servants, friends, merchants, or other trusted travelers to carry personal letters. A private message might wait until someone was already going toward the desired town. The sender could give the letter to that person, perhaps adding greetings to be spoken aloud upon arrival. Such correspondence did not depend on an official chain of stations. It depended on opportunity, trust, and familiar relationships. Across Egypt, Persia, China, Greece, and Rome, no single system can simply be called the first postal service. Each grew from its own landscape, traditions, and form of government. Most served rulers and administrations rather than the wider public. Still, common ideas appeared across the ancient world. There were known roads and recognized stopping places. There were official credentials, disciplined messengers, fresh horses, prepared vehicles, and places to rest. There were careful routines that allowed information to travel farther than any one person or animal could comfortably go without support. Beside the Nile, papyrus received the marks of a scribe. On the royal road, hooves crossed packed earth from station to station. In China, an official token opened the resources of a relay route. Around the Aegean, runners and maritime messengers connected cities divided by land and sea. Along Roman roads, permits, milestones, change stations, and lodging places guided official travelers through the empire. All of these systems answered a similar need. A ruler or administrator wished to know what was happening beyond the horizon. An order had to be carried outward. A report had to return. Distance could not be removed, but it could be divided into stages. In time, the Western Roman Empire fragmented, and some of its roads grew quieter. The stones did not disappear, nor did the human wish to send words across distance. Written messages continued to travel, but their journeys became more dependent on monasteries, merchants, royal households, travelers, and trusted local ties. Along the old roads, beneath changing rulers and evening skies. Chapter 3. Roads, Monasteries, and Medieval Messages. In the guest room of a medieval monastery, a traveler sits beside a narrow window. The light outside is pale, and the thick walls soften the sounds of the courtyard. On a wooden table lies a folded letter, its surface marked with a name and a description of a distant place. The address is not formed from a street and number. Instead, it points toward familiar landmarks, near the eastern gate, beside the stone church, beyond the market bridge, at the household known by a certain family name. Such directions depend upon local knowledge. Once the letter reaches the proper town, someone will recognize the church, the gate, the bridge, or the household. A member of the religious community has entrusted this letter to the traveler. Perhaps it contains instructions for another monastery. Perhaps it is a report, a legal record, or a copy of a scholarly text. The traveler places it carefully among his belongings. In the morning, he will follow the road toward the next town. He may carry the letter for only one part of its journey. There, he might pass it to a cleric traveling farther, or to a merchant whose route brings him closer to its destination. In this way, the message advances, not through one continuous public service, but from one trusted traveler to another. After Roman authority declined in Western Europe, the carrying of letters did not end. Some Roman roads remained in use, and many towns continued to stand where roads and rivers met. Yet political power was increasingly divided among kingdoms, lordships, cities, and estates. The large official infrastructure of the Roman world no longer reached across the Western landscape with the same consistency. In its place were many smaller networks, overlapping like quiet paths through a broad field. Kings and nobles maintained messengers for the affairs of their courts and territories. These messengers carried commands, reports, invitations, legal notices, and diplomatic letters. Some wore distinctive livery, meaning clothing in the colors or style of the household they served. Others carried a badge, a sealed document, or another credential showing that they traveled with authority. Their work required knowledge as well as endurance. A messenger needed to know which roads were passable, where rivers could be crossed, and which households might offer shelter. He had to recognize seals and protect the papers entrusted to him. Upon arriving, he might place a written letter into the recipient's hands, and then offer an oral explanation. The spoken message could provide tone and context that the written page did not contain. It might explain why the letter had been sent, how the sender appeared, or which part required particular attention. Written and spoken communication often traveled together, each supporting the other. Religious communities formed another set of connections. Monasteries, cathedral, chapters, churches, and other religious houses exchanged instructions, accounts, reports, and legal records. They communicated with bishops and rulers, preserved agreements, and shared scholarly works. A text copied in one house might travel to another, where it could be read or copied again. Yet monasteries did not run a single postal service for Europe. Their networks varied greatly, and their reach was limited by geography, resources, and personal relationships. One religious house might have strong connections with several nearby communities, and a few distant ones, while having little contact with places elsewhere. Still, these houses often received travelers. Clergy moved between churches, pilgrims followed familiar routes, students, officials, and visitors paused in guest rooms, much like the quiet room where our imagined letter began. A trustworthy traveler might be asked to carry a small packet onward, and so the letter passed from one careful hand to another. As universities developed in medieval European towns, they also needed ways to exchange messages. Scholars traveled between their homes and places of study. Institutions conducted business with church officials, rulers, patrons, and other centers of learning. Communication arrangements grew around these recurring needs. Students and teachers could carry correspondence, while trusted agents helped letters move between university communities and distant households. Merchants created dependable networks of a different kind. Trade relied upon information. Merchants needed to know what goods had arrived, which prices had changed, who had paid a debt, and when a ship or caravan might depart. A letter could carry instructions to an agent, news from a trading partner, or an account prepared in a counting room. Such correspondence traveled through established relationships. A merchant might entrust a packet to a shipmaster sailing from one harbor to another. An agent might give a letter to a caravan leader. A trading partner might place several messages in the care of a traveler already expected at the next market. These arrangements were not casual, even though they were not usually public services. Reputation mattered. A person known to deliver letters faithfully became a valued link between communities. As journeys were repeated, they formed recognizable channels of communication across roads, rivers, mountains, and seas. A letter might travel beside folded cloth or small objects of trade. It might rest in a leather pouch within a larger chest. At a harbor, it could wait for a trusted shipmaster. At an inland market, it might be handed to an agent who knew the road beyond. Each exchange required memory, judgment, and confidence in the next person. Beyond Western Europe, other systems developed according to different political traditions and timelines. The medieval world did not move in a single rhythm. Developments in Chinese, Islamic, Indian, Mongol, and European history did not occur at the same time or in identical ways. Each region responded to its own landscapes, institutions, and forms of government. Yet rulers and communities everywhere faced a similar question: how could information travel farther than one person could see? In the Islamic world, an official network known as the Barid carried government correspondence and reports. Mounted couriers traveled where roads and conditions favored horses, while foot messengers served other stages and local routes. By the 9th century, the bereed included organized routes, stations, regional officials, and a central administration. It was more than a means of carrying sealed papers. Reports moving through the network helped rulers understand events in distant provinces. In this sense, the bereed was also an instrument of government and intelligence, gathering information as well as carrying instructions. It mainly served official purposes. Private use was exceptional rather than ordinary. At a station, a courier could pause before the message continued. Perhaps a horse was changed, a report was registered, or a packet was placed in the care of another messenger. Behind that simple exchange stood the work of attendants, stable hands, record keepers, and local officials. A message moving steadily along its route depended upon many quiet preparations. Farther east, across a vast sweep of Eurasia, the Mongol Empire developed a relay system commonly called the yam. Its stations linked far-separated regions through a chain of stopping places. Authorized messengers and travelers could receive mounts, provisions, and shelter, allowing official communications to move in stages across immense distances. Credentials were essential. An official tablet or another recognized sign showed that a traveler had permission to use the system. With it, a messenger could obtain the resources assigned to government service. Without such authority, the horses, food, and shelter of the relay were not freely available. The yam, like the bereed, served government as well as communication. Messages helped administer territory, convey orders, and report conditions across the empire. Yet the efficiency visible on the road rested upon considerable local labor. Communities could be required to maintain stations, supply food, and keep horses ready. For a messenger, a fresh mount meant the journey could continue. For those supporting the station, it meant constant work and a substantial demand upon local resources. Every relay route had this quieter side. Roads did not carry letters by themselves. Horses needed fodder, water, and care. Buildings needed repair. Food had to be prepared. Runners needed rest. Clerks had to know which packet should travel in which direction. The movement of a few written sheets depended upon many hands whose owners might never see the words upon them. In medieval India, communication systems also used mounted couriers and foot runners. Records preserved by India Post describe horse and foot arrangements under the Delhi Sultanate. A rider could cover an open stage, while a runner could carry messages along routes suited to travel on foot. The two methods complemented one another, joining different landscapes into a continuing path. In the 16th century, Sher Shah expanded a horse post route as part of his administration. Stations and prepared mounts allowed official messages to proceed in relays. Once again, government communication drew upon roads, animals, attendants, and local knowledge. The route was not simply a line on a map. It was a sequence of inhabited places, each helping the message move onward. Across these many regions, no single pattern accounts for all medieval correspondence. A royal courier wearing a badge did not travel under the same conditions as a monk carrying a letter between religious houses. A merchant's packet aboard a ship belonged to a different network from an official report moving through the bereed. A Mongol credential opened stations unavailable to an ordinary traveler, while an Indian runner relied upon training, memory, and support along the route. Foot messengers, mounted couriers, clerics, merchants, shipmasters, and government officials all worked within different systems. Some served rulers, some served institutions, some served trade or scholarship. Others simply carried a letter because their own journey happened to lead in the right direction. Yet every messenger performed a related act. Each received words from someone who could not carry them personally. Each crossed a portion of the distance. Each placed those words into another person's keeping. The medieval period was therefore neither silent nor disconnected. Its communications were uneven, and a letter might wait for a suitable traveler, but messages continued to move through a living web of obligation and trust. Monasteries, universities, markets, harbors, caravans, households, and government stations all formed parts of that web. Let us return to the monastery guest room. Morning has reached the narrow window, and the traveler is ready to depart. The folded letter is secure among his belongings. Beyond the gate, the road passes through fields and toward a distant town. The letter may rest for several days before another convenient journey begins. Then it may travel beneath a cleric's cloak, inside a merchant's chest, or beside the official papers of a household messenger. It may cross a river in a small boat, pass beneath a city gate, or pause in a room where travelers share news of the roads ahead. At the edge of its destination, someone will ask for the church near the bridge, or the household beyond the market gate. A A resident will understand. A hand will point down a lane, and the long description written upon the folded page will become a real doorway. A knock will sound, the letter will be taken from its wrapping and placed into the hands for which it was intended. Behind that quiet arrival lies a chain of human attention. One person remembered the route. Another recognized the seal. Someone offered shelter, and someone cared for a horse. A runner carried the packet over a difficult stretch. A clerk directed it toward the proper road. A merchant, cleric, official, or traveler kept it safe for one more stage. Gradually, as journeys were repeated, certain routes became more dependable. Messengers began to be expected at familiar stopping places. Stations were maintained not merely for an occasional traveler, but for continuing service. Particular roads became recognized as regular lines along which messages could be sent. A letter would not always need to wait for chance or convenience. In some places, a rider might be expected at a known station, on a known road, at a roughly known time, and from these repeated journeys, these familiar roads, and these carefully maintained stages, the more regular postal route would quietly emerge. Chapter 4. The Rise of the Postal Route. Imagine a map spread across a wooden table. Rivers bend through fields, towns sit behind rings of wall, and roads run between them in lines. Along one road stands a chain of stations, each separated from the next by a distance a horse and rider can cover. At every station are a worker, a stable, a fresh horse, and a ledger waiting near the door. Most of the time the station is still. Then hoofbeats enter the yard. A rider arrives with a leather bag or folded packet. A horse is changed, a name and time recorded, and the message sent onward. Soon the sound fades down the road, and the station returns to its patient quiet, waiting for the next appointed stage. From the late 15th century onward, scenes like this became more regular along certain European routes. Courts needed contact with distant officials. Rulers whose lands were scattered across several regions needed reports, instructions, accounts, and legal documents to move reliably. Commercial cities depended on news of prices, cargoes, debts, and agreements. Household messengers, merchants, religious communities, and passing travelers remained important, but beside them grew a deliberately organized network of relays. A relay allowed one horse rider or carrier to take over from another. Instead of asking one tired horse to cover an entire journey, a courier could change mounts at appointed places. Sometimes the same rider continued, sometimes the bag passed to someone who knew the next section. The idea was simple: divide the route into stages and prepare someone at each stage to serve it. This is one source of post in its postal meaning. The English term is related to Italian posta and French poste, words for a placed or appointed station, especially one where horses or couriers could be found. Farther back lies the Latin idea of placing or positioning something. A post therefore did not originally mean only the letter service as a whole. It could be a stable, inn, roadside house, or other appointed stopping place where another stage began. Letters moved from post to post, and the way between them became a post road. The meaning of post road varied by country and era. It could describe a route equipped with relay stations, or a road officially designated for government messages or public mail. It might be a major highway, a rough country lane, or connected tracks. What mattered was not that every mile looked alike, but that the route was recognized and organized for repeated use. Among the most influential examples was the network associated with the Tasso family. Around 1500, family members helped organize communications for the Habsburg rulers. They later became known as Thurn and Taxis. The Habsburg territories were spread across several regions rather than gathered into one compact country. Courts and officials were separated by long distances, so messages had to pass among administrative centers, residences, and cities across different jurisdictions and languages. The Tasso couriers provided scheduled relays along important routes. Horses and riders waited at known places, and departures could be planned instead of invented anew for every letter. In time, the Thurn and Taxis network became the official courier organization of the Holy Roman Empire, holding that role through much of the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. The Holy Roman Empire was not the ancient Roman Empire, but a changing association of Central European territories with many rulers, cities, and institutions. Its roads crossed political boundaries and places governed in different ways. Communication therefore depended on contracts, privileges, agreements, and local arrangements. The network was influential and extensive, but not one uniform system covering all Europe. It existed beside royal couriers, city messengers, merchant services, and regional networks. Routes changed over time, relying on local authorities, riders, stable workers, and station keepers. No single morning marked the birth of the modern European post. Postal routes emerged gradually through repeated journeys, official contracts, revised schedules, new roads, and practical adjustments from station to station. Their most important quality was often not speed, but predictability. A swift messenger appearing only by chance could be less useful than a... Chapter 5. Letters Across Seas and Empires. At the edge of the harbor, a leather mailbag rested among barrels, wooden chests, and coils of tarred rope. Beyond it, sailing ships rose and settled gently with the water. Their masts made a slender forest against the sky, while gulls passed above tiled warehouses and glowing lamps. The road across fields and towns had ended at the quay, where the sea became the next road. A quay is a built landing place beside the water, where ships load and unload. Carts arrived with cargo, sailors carried provisions aboard, and clerks checked lists beside warehouse doors. For much of history, anyone sending a letter over the ocean needed patience and practical judgment. Before regular government contracts, a merchant, traveler, or postal clerk searched for a vessel sailing in the right direction and a captain willing to carry correspondence. Captains accepted letters as favors or for fees. These became known as ship letters. A ship letter might spend days or weeks in port before its voyage. It could wait at a merchant's office, an inn, a waterside post office, or with a shipping agent. This was an ordinary part of sea mail. The vessel might still be taking on cargo or repairs. Sailors gathered water, salted food, lamp oil, and rope. The captain might wait for favorable wind or a high tide. Meanwhile, the folded, sealed letter remained ready. When it went aboard, it might rest in the captain's chest or a canvas bag beneath the deck among cloth, sugar, tools, books, household goods, and passengers' luggage. Its progress depended upon the sea. Winds could be strong, light, or contrary. Currents helped or hindered, and a vessel might pause for maintenance or call at several ports. After crossing the ocean, a letter might wait for another ship, a riverboat, a wagon, or a mounted courier. Passage times varied with weather, repairs, schedules, and transfers. Writers learned to measure communication in weeks or months. A long silence often meant only that the letter was still moving or resting along its route. Governments eventually sought greater regularity. They contracted vessels to carry packets of letters and official dispatches on specified routes, and as conditions allowed, to schedules. These became packet ships. The packet was the bundle of papers itself. Packet service could not command wind or tides, but it gave writers clearer expectations. Merchants prepared correspondence for the next departure. Departments sent instructions in sequence, and families learned when a monthly packet might sail and when replies might return. Britain established an early transatlantic contract route in 1702. It carried mail between the West Indies and Falmouth on England's southwestern coast. Falmouth's position served vessels entering or leaving the Atlantic, and arriving mail could continue inland toward London and elsewhere. In 1755, a reliable monthly packet service began between Falmouth and New York and continued into the early 19th century. Its bags held government orders, commercial accounts, newspapers, personal news, and expressions of affection. Private sailing ships still carried much transatlantic correspondence. They might serve a more convenient port or depart sooner, and merchants often trusted particular captains. Official and private arrangements existed side by side. A letter gathered traces of this journey. One clerk might write the departure port in ink, another add a fee, and an arrival office stamp a date. When several administrations handled it, each might leave a sign of its part. The outside became a scattered record of ports, payments, transfers, and dates. A dark oval from a harbor office, figures for postage due, or a note directing it onward after the recipient moved. These practical instructions formed a quiet geography, a modest map, made not of coastlines, but of ink and human hands. As ocean mail expanded, It followed routes of commerce, migration, diplomacy, colonization, and empire. Letters connected people who had crossed the sea with those left behind. Settlers wrote about work, children, health, harvests, and unfamiliar landscapes. Officials sent reports, sailors wrote from ports, merchants exchanged prices and instructions, and migrants asked for news of remembered streets, farms, and villages. A page arriving after many months could preserve a familiar voice. Handwriting, words, and folds in the paper became small pieces of home. Yet these systems were not neutral. Imperial postal routes supported administration and economic extraction. They helped governments issue orders, collect information, manage territories, and direct valuable goods. The same route that bore a family letter could carry documents of unequal power. Although official histories often centered European institutions, the networks relied on indigenous and local workers. They guided travelers along inland paths, handled boats, cared for animals, translated languages, carried bags, and understood seasonal conditions. A line on an imperial map worked only because people knew where water could be found, when rivers were passable, which paths connected settlements, and how conditions changed through the year. Official records did not always describe their labor fully. Postal connections therefore held several meanings at once. They joined families and supported trade, while helping empires govern and extract wealth. A page might be personal, commercial, diplomatic, or official. Its journey reflected intimate hopes and large institutions. Still, the physical routine was simple. A letter was folded, addressed, perhaps marked with a fee, placed with other papers, carried to a harbor, and entrusted to a vessel. Large systems depended on small, repeated acts. Across these routes, waiting remained part of correspondence. Families could not know whether silence came from calm winds, a mistransfer, repairs, or a letter resting in a port office. The uncertainty asked for patience. Replies often crossed with new messages already outward bound, so news arrived out of sequence. Still, writers continued. Each sheet carried the hope that ships, clerks, agreements, and local carriers would join their separate efforts and bring distant lives briefly together across the water and along the roads beyond. In the late 1830s, a new sound entered Atlantic harbors. Beside creaking timber, gulls, and water came the steady rhythm of steam machinery. Steamships did not depend entirely on favorable winds and could keep schedules more regularly, though change was gradual. Sailing ships carried letters for decades, and harbors held both tall masts and dark funnels. The British government contracted the Cunard Line for regular mail service to Halifax and Boston, making North Atlantic departures and arrivals more predictable. In 1847, the United States established its own subsidized transatlantic steamship mail service. Even with steam, every crossing required coordination. Bags had to reach the proper quay, clerks prepared lists and checked seals, ships needed maintenance, fuel, crews, and arrangements at each port. Workers had to receive arriving mail and send it onward. Governments and postal authorities also made postal conventions, agreements explaining how administrations exchanged letters, charged fees, and divided payments. Such rules reduced uncertainty between systems with different laws and customs. As a letter passed between administrations, its markings showed where it had been, what had been paid, and what remained to do. At the outward harbor, a clerk checked bundles and entered figures in a ledger. Ink dried beside columns of names, ports, and fees. Letters were gathered into canvas sacks, then closed and sealed. Dock workers carried them across the quay. An officer received them and placed them securely aboard. Ropes were drawn in. Sails rose or steam machinery began its measured labor, and the harbor widened behind the vessel. Below deck, the letters waded through mist, sunlight, calm water, and changing wind. Watches changed, meals were prepared, and equipment was checked, while the horizon moved slowly around the ship. A sailing vessel might lean beneath the wind. Chapter 6. The Birth of the Public Post Office. The canvas bag that had crossed the sea was carried from the harbor into a narrow street. There, between a merchant's shop and a modest inn, stood a small letter office. Nothing about it resembled the grand public buildings that later generations would associate with national postal services. There were no marble steps or high stone columns. A painted sign hung above the doorway, and a small brass bell sounded whenever someone entered. Inside, a wooden counter divided the public space from the clerk's working room. Ledgers rested in a row upon a shelf. A ledger was a book used for accounts and official records. Its pages were ruled with careful lines for names, places, payments, and dates. On the wall stood a sorting case filled with pigeonholes. Each pigeonhole was a small, open compartment used for sorting papers and letters. Labels beneath them named towns, roads, ports, and distant regions. There were pots of ink, sticks of sealing wax, lengths of string, and a shallow container of fine drying sand. The sand could be scattered lightly over fresh ink. Then the grains were gently tipped away, leaving the clerk's writing dry enough to be handled. This modest room represented an important change. For much of history, organized courier systems had chiefly served rulers, armies, officials, and wealthy institutions. Their roads and relay stations might pass near ordinary communities, yet most people could not simply place a personal letter into the royal mail. Gradually, however, some official networks began to accept correspondence from a wider public. This did not happen everywhere at the same time, or according to one shared plan. Each country developed its postal arrangements differently. Some services grew from royal courier systems, others developed from city messengers or the networks maintained by merchants. There was no single moment when the post became public everywhere. Access emerged slowly through laws, local customs, experiments, and changing expectations. Britain offers one useful example of this gradual opening, although it should not be treated as a universal model. In the early 16th century, the government of Henry VIII established a formal royal postal office. Its chief purpose was to carry correspondence for the monarch and the state. Mounted messengers traveled along recognized routes, with fresh horses provided at appointed stages. The system belonged to the machinery of government, and its first concern was official communication. Yet a maintained route was difficult to keep entirely separate from the needs of the wider population. Merchants had news and accounts to send. Families wished to correspond. Lawyers, landowners, church officials, and tradespeople all had reasons to place written words into reliable hands. Over time, private letters began to travel alongside official correspondence, sometimes by permission and sometimes through less formal arrangements. Then in 1635, during the reign of Charles I, the domestic royal post was opened to public use. For a fee, members of the public could send letters along the established post roads. This was a significant widening of access. Even so, it did not mean that everyone could suddenly use the service easily or regularly. In 1660, under Charles II, the General Post Office was formally established. The term General Post Office can refer to the central administration overseeing a postal service. It can also refer to that administration's principal building. In later centuries, such a building might become a prominent feature of a capital city, but the local post office was often a much quieter and more ordinary place. It might occupy part of a shop, inn, or tavern. Sometimes it was simply a room in the postmaster's home. The postmaster might also be an innkeeper, bookseller, merchant, or shopkeeper. Early postmasters were not always salaried civil servants whose only occupation was postal work. Many combined their postal duties with another business. A traveler entering an inn might therefore find horses waiting in the yard, food being prepared in the kitchen, and a postal ledger open in the front room. A shop selling paper, ribbons, candles, and ink might also receive the town's letters. Local people learned where their mail was accepted. They also learned when the bag would be closed and prepared for dispatch. Near the appointed hour, a sender stepped through the door. The brass bell gave its soft note, and a folded letter was placed upon the wooden counter. The address had been written on the exterior. The clerk examined the packet and asked where it was going. Then came the slower work of calculating the charge. The amount charged to send an item was called its rate. Early postal rates were commonly determined by distance, route, and the number of sheets in the letter. A letter sent to a nearby town might carry one charge, while a letter passing through several stages might carry another. The clerk might consult a printed table or a handwritten guide. He would trace the route, consider the distance, and count the sheets. Even an additional sheet of paper could increase the cost. When the calculation was complete, the clerk wrote or stamped a marking on the folded exterior. This might show where the letter had entered the system, when it had been accepted, what route it should follow, or how much was due. Payment was often not made by the sender. Instead, the recipient paid when the letter was delivered. This arrangement meant that a sender did not always need to know the full cost in advance. Yet it also created uncertainty at the far end of the journey. The person receiving the letter might be asked to pay a considerable amount. If the charge seemed too high, the recipient could refuse the letter. The folded paper would then remain unopened, although the words inside might already have traveled for many days. For families with limited means, the cost of correspondence required careful thought. A letter might be warmly welcomed, but the rate could still represent a noticeable household expense. Writers therefore tried to use their paper carefully, fitting their news onto as few sheets as possible. At the letter office, the markings helped guide each item through the system. Some were written by hand, others were applied with inked stamps. Early postmarks helped show where or when a letter had entered the post. They also encouraged accountability. If a bag arrived late, or a letter followed the wrong road, the markings allowed clerks to understand at least part of its journey. Some letters carried a frank. Franking was a marking that showed payment or exemption from payment. Certain officials had the privilege of sending correspondence without the usual charge. The clerk had to recognize the proper mark, treat the letter accordingly, and record it correctly. Behind the wooden counter, the day followed a steady pattern. A mail bag arrived. Before opening it, the clerk examined its fastening and checked its seal. He entered the arrival in the ledger, removed the bundles, and compared them with the accompanying record. Letters intended for the town were placed in one pigeonhole. Letters continuing north went into another. A coastal route had its own compartment, as did the road toward the capital. The clerk checked charges and copied totals. He recorded incoming and outgoing bags, prepared accounts, and arranged the next dispatch. String was untied and retied, ink dried beneath a light covering of sand. Letters moved from the counter to the ledger, from the ledger to the sorting case, and from one labeled pigeonhole to another. At the proper hour, the clerk gathered the letters for each route. He arranged them into bundles, wrapped and tied them, then placed them inside a canvas or leather bag. The bag was fastened and made ready for the next rider or coach. These modest actions connected the local letter office to a much larger system. A letter handed across one wooden counter might pass through many similar rooms. In each one, clerks repeated the same quiet sequence: receive, record, mark, sort, bundle, dispatch. Postal reliability grew from this patient repetition. It depended on clear accounts, familiar routes, accurate labels, and people willing to perform small duties carefully, day after day. Yet the word public must be understood with care. A postal service open to public use was not necessarily affordable to everyone, nor was it always nearby. Someone living in a remote village might have to travel many miles to reach the nearest letter office. Roads could be difficult, deliveries infrequent, and local arrangements uneven. Literacy shaped access as well. Many people could not read or write. Others were comfortable only in a language that was not commonly used by postal officials. Someone wishing to send a letter might ask a schoolmaster, clergyman, clerk, or literate neighbor to write it on their behalf. When a letter arrived, another person might be needed to read it aloud. Cost, geography, literacy, language, and social status all influenced who could make practical use of the post. The service was becoming more public, but it was not yet universal. It was not equally accessible, equally affordable, or equally convenient. There was another limit as well. Postal systems remained closely connected to governments, and governments understood that letters carried information. Correspondence could be inspected. Postal officials might also be required to record information to the authorities. The opening of the post to private letters therefore brought both connection and oversight. The same network that carried family news and business instructions could also serve the interests of the state. Still, the small letter office changed the meaning of distance. Its unassuming doorway provided an entrance into a network far larger than the town itself. A merchant could send an account to a distant partner. A traveler could write home. A parent might receive news from a grown child living beyond the familiar roads. The service was imperfect, uneven, and often expensive, yet it gave more people a recognized path by which their words could travel. As evening settled over the narrow street, fewer visitors came through the door. At last, the brass bell became quiet. The clerk remained beneath the lamplight, preparing the final letters for dispatch. Around him stood the familiar objects of his working day. There were ledgers filled with orderly lines, bundles secured with string, inked markings, labeled pigeonholes, and a shallow dish of drying sand. He selected one folded letter and studied its address. Then he looked down a table of distances. He followed the route through several postal stages, checked the number of sheets, and calculated the fee. The answer required several small decisions, followed by one careful figure written in ink. It was a familiar task. Clerks had performed calculations like it many times before, yet its complexity suggested the quiet appeal of a simpler idea. What if the sender could pay in advance? What if there were one predictable rate, easy to understand? And what if proof of that payment could be shown by a small printed sign, attached directly to the letter? Chapter 7. Stamps, Envelopes, and a Simple Reform. The clerk's question remained in the warm circle of lamplight. What if the sender could pay before the letter began its journey? What if the charge were predictable, without a fresh calculation for every road and postal stage? And what if payment could be shown by something small enough to rest in the corner of a folded sheet? By the 1830s, questions like these were being asked throughout Britain. The Postal Service had grown into a wide and practiced institution, but its charges and accounting rules were often criticized as expensive and difficult to understand. The cost of a letter might depend upon the distance it traveled and the number of sheets it contained. Clerks needed tables, route knowledge, and careful arithmetic. At the far end of the journey, another postal worker might have to collect the fee from the person receiving the letter. Each rule had once seemed to serve a purpose. Together, however, the rules had become a thicket of figures and exceptions. A letter was light enough to hold between two fingers, yet the accounting around it could feel surprisingly heavy. Among those who considered the problem was Rowland Hill, a central advocate for postal reform. In 1837, he published a pamphlet called Post Office Reform, Its Importance and Practicability. Its title was formal, but its central ideas were clear. Hill argued for a less costly and more straightforward domestic postal system. Instead of calculating a different fee for every distance, the post could use a more uniform rate, based chiefly on weight. Uniform postage meant a standardized charge, rather than a separate calculation for each distance. A letter traveling a short way and one traveling much farther could therefore cost the same, provided they belonged to the same weight category. Distance still mattered greatly to the people and horses carrying the mail, but it no longer needed to shape every small transaction at the counter. The proposals also moved payment toward the beginning of the journey. Prepayment simply meant that the sender paid the postal charge before the item traveled. This reduced the work of calculating and collecting money at the destination. The receiving clerk would not have to explain a complicated fee, and the recipient would not need to find the correct coins before accepting the message. Yet prepayment required proof. A postal worker needed to see, quickly and confidently, that the charge had already been paid. The proof had to be clear and convenient to use. One answer was a tiny printed label with gum on the back. An adhesive stamp is attached using gum or another adhesive. It could be bought, placed upon a letter, and presented at the post office. In that small piece of paper, payment became visible. The reform was not the work of one person alone. Rowland Hill was a central advocate and later an important administrator, but change depended upon many hands and voices. Campaigners supported the effort. Printers worked through practical details. Officials examined procedures. Parliament considered and authorized changes. Members of the public responded to the promise of a simpler service. Postal reform, like the postal system itself, was a shared undertaking. Uniform penny postage began in Britain in January 1840. The new rate made the basic charge easier to anticipate. It was a penny for a light domestic letter, with weight serving as the chief measure, rather than the number of miles ahead. A penny was not a trivial sum to every household. Nor could a lower rate give reading and writing skills to those who had been denied opportunities to learn. The reform did not suddenly place easy correspondence within everyone's reach. Affordability remained relative, and literacy remained unequal. Still, cheaper and more predictable postage broadened the circle of people who could consider sending a letter. The rules were easier to explain, and the cost could be known before the first line was written. Something once surrounded by calculations was becoming simpler and more familiar. Then, on May 1st, 1840, a new object went on sale. It was dark, finely printed, and small enough to disappear beneath a thumb. The stamp showed the profile of the young Queen Victoria. Her face was surrounded by delicate lettering and patterned corners. The image was produced by engraving, a printing method in which lines are cut into a hard surface. Those lines hold the ink used to print the design, allowing fine details to appear even upon a very small object. The stamp became known as the penny black. It was valid for postage from May 6, 1840, and is recognized as the world's first adhesive postage stamp used in a public postal system. At a post office counter, the action required was wonderfully modest. A person bought the stamp. Its gummed back was lightly moistened. It was pressed onto the letter and smoothed into place. A dark little portrait now stood as evidence that the postal charge had been paid. Once the letter entered the system, a postal worker marked the stamp with a cancellation. This firm mark showed that the stamp had been used, so it could not be used again. The cancellation crossed the printed surface in dark ink. Design and administration met there in the corner of the letter. There was a careful engraving, a dampened patch of gum, and a practical mark made by a postal clerk. The object was decorative, but it was also a tool. It replaced part of a complicated accounting process with something that could be recognized at a glance. Other stamps followed in Britain and elsewhere, bearing different colors, values, portraits, and symbols. Other countries adopted stamps and postal reforms at different times and in different ways. The penny black did not make inexpensive public mail available throughout the world overnight. Every postal administration had its own laws, currencies, routes, and habits to consider. Even so, the small stamp offered a useful model. Payment could be made in advance and displayed plainly upon the item being sent. As postage became simpler, the form of the letter also began to change. For centuries, correspondence had often folded the written sheet inward to form its own cover. The address was written on the outer face, and the folded edges might be fastened with wax or a wafer seal. A wafer seal was a small disc, moistened and pressed between layers of paper to hold them closed. It was thin and unobtrusive, but it served the quiet purpose of keeping the folded letter together. Envelopes existed before 1840. Rowland Hill did not invent them, yet older charging systems could make a separate envelope impractical. If postage depended upon the number of sheets, then placing a letter inside another piece of paper might increase the fee. Writers therefore became skilled at arranging their words upon one sheet, leaving room for an address, and folding the paper into a neat packet. When lower charges came to be based chiefly on weight, an envelope became easier to use without automatically creating a new postal cost. Imagine a stationer's shop in the soft light of afternoon. Writing paper lies in orderly stacks. Nearby are pen nibs, bottles of ink, sealing wax, and small wafers waiting to be moistened. Among these familiar objects are folded envelopes, pale and clean, ready to receive a letter. An envelope gives the written sheet a separate covering. It helps protect the words from dust and repeated handling. It also keeps the writing away from casual view as the message passes across counters, into bags, and along the road. During the 19th century, machine production expanded the supply of envelopes. Paper could be cut and folded into regular shapes in increasing numbers. Early manufactured envelopes might still be fastened with wax or moistened wafers. Later, gummed flaps became common, allowing the sender to dampen the edge and press it closed. The motions were simple and unhurried. A sheet was folded, it slipped into its paper covering, the flap was sealed, the address was written in a clear hand. Finally, the stamp was moistened and settled into its corner. These changes were small when considered separately. A standard rate, a light envelope, a patch of gum, a printed portrait. Yet together they made correspondence more convenient and easier to understand. A person did not need to know the price of every mile along the route in order to prepare a letter correctly. The post office still managed roads, mailbags, accounts, and distant destinations, but some of that complexity had been moved away from the customer at the counter. Prepayment also reduced the work waiting at the other end. The letter could arrive without a fresh charge to calculate and collect. The recipient could simply accept the message that had traveled to the door. Predictable postage helped encourage many kinds of mail. Families could exchange news with greater regularity. Businesses sent orders, replies, invoices, and other commercial correspondence. Newspapers made use of widening postal connections. Greeting cards carried brief messages for holidays and personal occasions. Mail-order businesses invited customers to choose goods at a distance and send requests through the post. None of this arrived all at once, and none of it reached every home equally. The changes unfolded gradually. Affordability remained relative, literacy remained uneven, and postal systems beyond Britain followed their own courses. Still, cheaper and more predictable postage helped broaden the practice of letter writing. The stamp became a recognizable symbol of this change. It turned an invisible financial arrangement into a visible object, something that could be purchased, held between the fingers, and placed carefully upon a letter. Its surface was tiny, yet it carried a clear administrative meaning. The clerk beneath the lamp no longer needs to trace every postal stage merely to establish the basic charge. He weighs the item, confirms the rate, and looks toward its upper corner. There rests the small dark stamp, square and orderly with the young queen's profile, surrounded by fine engraved lines. The envelope is placed with others. Their pale edges form a neat stack upon the counter. Soon they are gathered into a bundle and secured. Then the bundle is lowered into a mailbag, whose canvas sides settle around it. The stamp has simplified the beginning of the journey, but it cannot carry the letter onward by itself. Beyond the post office windows, lamps glow beside the road. A coach waits to depart, its horses standing quietly in the evening air. The harness rests against their coats. The driver checks the hour. Canvas sacks are made ready, and the last bundle of letters is brought out from the lighted office. Farther away, rails run toward a station platform. There, clocks and timetables will guide a different rhythm. Mailbags will pass beneath lamps, doors will close, and steam will drift through the evening air. The small stamp has settled into its corner. Now the letter must begin to move. Chapter 8: Stagecoaches, Railways, and Sorting on the Move. The coach, waiting beyond the post office, is built for a clear and practical purpose. Its body is strong, its lamps are polished, and its wheels have been checked before the evening departure. Leather straps hold the luggage and mail securely. Inside the canvas sacks, letters rest in folded bundles, their stamps marked with dark postmarks to show that the postage has been used. The driver gathers the reins. Nearby, a guard watches over the mail and keeps track of the appointed hour. Then the horses lean gently into their harness. The wheels begin to turn, and the post office slowly recedes into the lamplight. For centuries, mounted messengers had carried letters from one place to another. In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, however, the mail coach brought greater regularity to many routes. Britain introduced its first official mail coach service in 1784, following proposals by John Palmer, a theater owner who had observed how reliably stagecoaches could travel between towns. He believed that mail could move more quickly and predictably in dedicated coaches, rather than depending on slower arrangements. Mail coaches followed schedules, changed horses at appointed stages, and stopped only where necessary. The word stage referred to one section of a longer journey. At the end of each stage, a rested team could replace the tired horses, allowing the coach to continue without a long pause. These stopping places became familiar points on the postal map. An inn yard might be quiet before the coach arrived. Then hooves sounded along the road, lamps appeared in the distance, and stable workers prepared the next team. Mail bags were handed down, and others were lifted aboard. The horses were changed, the driver looked toward the road ahead, and the coach continued beneath the night sky. The schedule mattered almost as much as speed. People could begin to trust that a letter posted on a certain day would leave at a known hour and follow a recognized route. Post offices adjusted their routines to the coach timetable. Clerks tied bundles, sealed sacks, and prepared dispatch papers before the appointed departure. A late bag could delay the mail of more than one town, so each small task was completed with care. Roads improved gradually, surfaces were repaired, bridges strengthened, and milestones showed the distance. Turnpike roads supported by tolls collected at gates helped finance better routes in Britain and elsewhere. Travel could still be affected by mud, snow, steep hills, and the condition of the horses. Even so, the mail coach gave the landscape a more dependable rhythm. Its passing became part of the ordinary life of villages and towns. Across the water, another change was taking place. Steam engines were being fitted to ships. Sailing vessels depended greatly upon the direction and strength of the wind, while steamships could follow schedules with greater consistency. Early steamships often carried sails as well as engines. Using whichever source of power best suited the conditions, their paddle wheels, and later their screw propellers, pushed vessels along rivers, through coastal waters, and eventually across oceans. Mail traveled aboard these ships in locked rooms or secure compartments. At a harbor, Sacks from inland post offices were counted and transferred to the vessel. After the crossing, they entered another network of carts, coaches, boats, and roads. Steam did not remove distance, but it made many long journeys more regular. A sender could have a clearer idea of when a ship might depart and when a letter might reach a distant shore. And then, rails began to extend across the countryside. At first, railways were built as separate lines, joining particular towns, mines, ports, and industrial centers. Before long, postal authorities recognized what these iron routes could offer. A locomotive did not tire as a horse did. It could pull many carriages, carry a great weight of mail, travel through the night, and keep to a timetable measured with increasing precision. The relationship between the railway and the post office soon became close. Stations developed into new points of exchange. A horse-drawn cart might bring sacks from a local post office to the station. Porters placed them aboard a train, and at another town they were unloaded for the next stage. Large clocks watched over the platforms. Printed timetables connected distant places through orderly columns of hours and minutes. Yet railway transport offered more than faster carriage. The time spent in motion could also become time spent sorting. In Britain, an experimental railway sorting office began operating in 1838 on the route between Birmingham and Liverpool. It developed into what became known as the Travelling Post Office, or TPO. Other countries established similar services under different names. In the United States, railway post offices became an important part of the mail system during the 19th century, with specially trained clerks working aboard designated cars. From the outside, a railway postal car might resemble an ordinary carriage. Inside, however, it was a compact post office in motion. Wooden sorting cases stood along the walls, divided into many narrow compartments. Each compartment was labeled for a town, a district, a connecting railway line, or an onward route. Hooks and racks held open mail bags. A work table provided space for reading addresses, checking letters, and tying bundles. Lamps illuminated the rows of pigeonholes, as the small compartments were often called. When a fresh sack arrived, a clerk loosened its cord and spread the letters across the table. Beneath him, the train rolled steadily onward. The carriage swayed around curves, wheels sounded over the joints in the rails, and station lights passed briefly across the windows. The clerk read each address and placed the letter into the correct compartment. This required more than a simple knowledge of geography. He had to understand the network itself. A letter's destination might lie far from the railway line. The clerk therefore needed to know at which station it should be transferred, and which later route would carry it onward. He learned town names, branch lines, delivery districts, and the connections between trains. The address named the destination, but the clerk's knowledge revealed the path. Postal clerks were often tested on this knowledge. They studied route schemes and practiced sorting until the movement became calm and exact. An experienced clerk could glance at an address and recognize not only where the place was, but how the letter should travel in order to reach it efficiently. Several clerks might work side by side. One opened the incoming bags, others sorted the letters into the cases, another gathered the contents of a completed compartment, aligned the envelopes, tied them into bundles, and placed them in a labeled sack. Dispatch records were checked, seals were applied, and the finished bags were made ready for a station still many miles ahead. So, while the train crossed fields and rivers, the mail was already being prepared for its next journey. Hours once used only for transportation had become working hours as well. A bag unloaded at dawn no longer held only a mixed collection requiring a full morning of attention. Much of its sorting had already been completed along the way. At some points, trains exchanged mail without making a full stop. Trackside equipment held a waiting pouch that railway clerks could collect, while an outgoing bag was released for postal workers beside the line. The exchange depended upon careful placement, steady timing, and well-practiced routines. Most mail, however, still passed through stations in the ordinary manner, carried between carts, platforms, and railway cars by many hands. The railway also encouraged postal systems to coordinate their clocks. If one train met another, and mail had to pass between them, a small difference in local time could create confusion. During the 19th century, railways helped promote the adoption of standardized time within countries. Postal schedules became part of this wider arrangement of shared hours. In busy railway offices, the day was organized around departures. A clerk might say that a bag had to be closed for the evening train. This meant that after a particular moment, no more letters could be added. The sack was tied, labeled, sealed, and entered into the records. A porter carried it to a waiting cart or directly to the platform. The train then took it onward, joining one timetable to another. The change did not mean that coaches disappeared at once. They continued to serve routes beyond the rails and carried mail between stations and smaller communities. Ships joined ports across the seas, ferries crossed rivers and channels. In some places, pack animals and foot messengers still completed the final distance. The modern postal network was not simply one machine replacing everything that had come before. It was a patient joining of many forms of movement. Roads met rails, rails reached harbors, ships crossed the water, and carts waited on the farther shore. A single letter might leave a village by cart, cross the country by rail, travel through the night in a sorting car, continue aboard a steamship, and return to land in another nation. At every stage, its address guided the hands that received it. Each worker completed one part of the journey and quietly prepared the way for the next. Inside the moving postal car, the steady work continued beneath warm lamps. Envelopes whispered against one another. Canvas sacks rested below the sorting cases. Beyond the windows, dark fields gave way to quiet stations, and quiet stations gave way to rows of town lights. The clerk reached for another envelope. He read the address, recalled the proper route, and placed it in its compartment. Around him, bundles gathered and sacks slowly filled. The railway car rocked gently onward, carrying not only the mail, but a working post office through the measured night. Before the train reached the next platform, another bundle was tied, and another bag stood ready. The door opened, mail passed outward into the care of a waiting clerk, while new sacks came aboard. For a few moments the platform filled with purposeful movement beneath the station lamps. Then the doors closed, the platform slipped away, and the train continued onward. Behind it lay the roads once traveled mainly by horses. Ahead were more stations, more connections, and beyond them, the streets where letter carriers would soon bring these private messages to individual doors.